I think we're at time, so we can start. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good lunch break to everyone who has joined us today. Thank you to Amy and Asma for being on screen as well, my co-presenters. All right, so let me start with a few housekeeping rules. Thank you for joining us, of course, today. This webinar is recorded, which means it will be shared on our website. The full participant list won't be shown in the recording, but anything that you might say in the chat might appear. So if you want to ask questions in the Q&A function, you can choose to do so anonymously if you don't want your name to appear. The chat has been disabled, but you can ask questions or make comments in the Q&A feature of the Zoom webinars. So don't hesitate to do so, and you can do so anonymously, as I mentioned. I'm going to really quickly introduce Amy and Asma, and then we're going to go ahead with the first bit of our webinar, and I'll present the agenda. So Amy and I are both senior program officers at SAR, at Scholars at Risk. We are in charge of, respectively, for Amy, the current cohort of SAR fellows. And as for me, I'm coordinating the recruitment of the future cohort for next year of SAR fellows. And as Mahedi Neri, Amy will do a proper introduction of your academic credentials later, but is a current fellow in our current cohort, and so you'll be able to share your experience of the program with everyone in about 10 to 15 minutes. We will also be joined by Frank Fernandez, who used to be was a firm. Oh, here he is. Was a former fellow as well in our program. So that's about it. Hi, Frank. That's about it for housekeeping. Let me now reshare the PowerPoint so you can follow along with me on a quick presentation. Here. Hopefully you can see my screen. All right. So this is today's agenda. We're going to give you a very quick overview of the fellowships, the two tracks of the fellowship for the future cohort. We're going to talk about format, eligibility, calendar, application requirements, and evaluation criteria, Amy and I. Then you'll be able to hear from Asma and Frank, and then we'll leave about half of the webinar for Q&A. You can start listing questions in the Q&A feature of the webinar if you so chooses. All right. So this year, some of you might be familiar with our fellowship, but this year we have two tracks. We're going to be recruiting two cohorts of about six individuals working on either global academic freedom or on US academic freedom, as in academic freedom in the context of the US. So we are not being prescriptive with thematic priorities per se for the Global Mellon Academic Freedom Fellowship. Any focus on global, comparative, single country issues, excluding the US, is welcome. As for the US fellowship, we are interested in projects that will focus specifically on the US. It doesn't mean that you have to be currently or in the future based in the US, but the thematic focus of the work has to be on the United States. And we are focusing on certain topics, which you can see on the slide. The format is the same for both tracks. The duration of the program is about 10 months, which is the school year in most places. It will run from September 2026 to June 2027. The recruited fellows will receive a stipend of about $8,000 in two installments, halfway through and at the beginning and at the middle of the fellowships. The structure is mostly monthly workshops, online workshops. The whole fellowship program is remote. During the workshops, there will be a first phase of trainings, onboarding, and all that. And then from January, we're going to go into individual presentations where you're going to be able to give and receive feedbacks from the peers in your respective cohorts. In terms of eligibility, you have everything in the call, which I'm going to put again in the chat, or maybe Amy can do that. But we are focusing on, it's an opportunity that is focusing on early career researchers, mostly people who are in the final stages of their PhD project, or have completed their PhD within the last 8 years. You must be affiliated with a higher education institution, an association, a research organization of some sort by the time of the fellowship start in September. Of course, the fellowship is intended to foster research and a community of researchers working on academic freedom or higher education values. So there must be a demonstrated interest, in your CV and in your, path on these issues. The commitment is to participate in those monthly online workshops I was just mentioning about. And that's the calendar. This opportunity has been launched about a week ago. We are having a webinar Q&A today. The deadline is at the end of the month on the 29th of May, midnight New York time, so East time is the deadline for applications. The applications have to be submitted online on the link that is in the call, so make sure you have access to that prior to the deadline. And we're hoping to make announcements on selected candidates by the end of the month or very early July, right? And then the program, as I mentioned before, is going to run from September to June. And I'm going to hand over to Amy to talk us through the application package content and the eligibility and the evaluation criteria for selection.
Hi, everyone. Happy to see you all online today. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning. So I'm going to talk about the application requirements and also, the application requirements and also the selection criteria. So to give you a little bit of a sense about what we look for in the applications when reviewing applications. So when you are applying, you will fill out an application on a platform called Form Facade. It will ask you to submit some biographical information. Please make sure to fill all of it out. It will also ask you to submit within a single PDF an abstract that summarizes your research, a research plan and timeline that should be a maximum of 2 pages that describes your research methodology and your this kind of step-by-step plans that you plan to take during the 10-month fellowship. And then a CV that includes information, contact information for 2 professional references. There is a note there that if your PhD is pending, please indicate in your application your expected completion date. One of the questions that we've already received a few times in the chat is about the PhD requirement. I will say that there is a requirement that you have a PhD to apply for this fellowship, and there is also a requirement that you are no further out than 8 years from finishing your PhD to apply for the fellowship. I will note that on occasion, the selection committee does make exceptions. One of those exceptions is if you have not yet received your PhD, but you are very close to finishing your PhD, we may make an exception for you. I don't have a specific, I would say you should be within a year of finishing your PhD and in sort of the final stages of completing your dissertation if we are going to consider an exception for you. I also saw in the chat just now there was a question along those lines that asked about institutional affiliation, and we do also require that you have some kind of institutional affiliation throughout the whole of your research fellowship. That can be with an academic institution, but it could also be with a research organization. And then in terms of also the 8-year requirement, no more than 8 years out from your PhD, I think we've rarely made exceptions. I'm not sure actually I can think of any exceptions we've made in terms of the 8-year requirement. But if you would like to request an exception because, for example, your career has been disrupted by conflict or imprisonment or some kind of political violence, then you can describe that in your application and request that we make an exception for you. The last thing I will, so the application material requires that you submit all of those in a single PDF, and then it also requires that you answer a series of short answer questions. The application, the abstract and research plan, I would say refers to the research product, and then these short answer questions refer a little bit more, ask you to elaborate a bit more on what you plan to do with that research. So Morgan, if you could advance the slide. I believe the next slide is on the short answer questions. So there are a series of 6 short answer questions that ask you to talk about what you hope to achieve from the project, what formats you're planning to share your research in, how you plan to share your research findings. One of the goals of this fellowship is that it is you are not just doing research for academic publication, but it's also an opportunity to engage in public scholarship and to influence kind of discourse and policy around academic freedom. And so that's why we ask these questions about not just academic publications, but also other forms of research outputs. So plans for dissemination, audience, um, and then there's 2 questions at the end. One is about security risks. So we would like to often research on academic freedom poses some degree of security risk either to yourself as the researcher and or to your research participants. So we would like you to describe in that short answer any possible security risks and how you plan to mitigate those risks. We want to know that you have a plan in place. And then finally, how will you measure the success of your project? Continuing on, I'll talk a little bit about the criteria through which we evaluate your application. So Morgan, great, thank you. These you can see on the screen 4 general categories of evaluation criteria. The first is thematic relevance. That is, we are looking to see whether first of all, the big question is, does your project address academic freedom and or other higher education related values? That is an absolute requirement. If your project does not address those issues, then it will not be considered for this fellowship. We want to see there that, second, sort of, we are also within that, we are looking at whether your project is purely descriptive as opposed to analytic in some way. So we rate higher projects that are, for example, comparative in some sense, look at the relationship between academic freedom and other concepts. If you are purely looking at a country and describing academic freedom conditions in that country, your project is a little bit less likely to be rated as highly. We want to see that your project has some degree of analytical significance. Second, in terms of significance, creativity, and contribution to the field, we want to, so the analytic part, I think actually would fall under the significance, creativity, and contribution to field. We generally we also want to see you citing relevant academic literature. So we want to see a sort of initial literature review supporting your research question and also describing the kinds of research gaps that your project fills. Third, we're looking at whether your project is feasible and what you plan to complete within the timeline of the fellowship. The timeline of the fellowship, 10 months, is probably too short to complete a full research project. It's also okay if you've already started on your project before applying for this fellowship, but we want to know where you are in your project and what you think you are going to be able to complete during the fellowship. And then if you are not finished by the end of the fellowship, which is highly likely, how you plan to continue on with your research following the fellowship. So generally, how will this fellowship support you in carrying out your research project? At what stages and at what components of the project? And then finally, we look at researcher qualifications. We're looking to see, to compare the methodology that you've proposed to your background and qualifications to make sure that it looks like you have the skills to carry out the research project. And we also look at whether it appears that you have an interest in contributing to academic freedom issues in the future. If you've never done research related to academic freedom before, I would encourage you to address in your application how you plan to continue engaging in that topic in the future, because one of the goals of the fellowship is to be promoting and supporting scholars who are interested in pursuing academic freedom as a topic of research in the longer term. I think I will stop there. And we will continue to answer some questions in the chat. We'll also have time in a few minutes for everybody on the webinar to ask their own questions. But for the moment, I'm going to introduce Asma Nairi and Frank Fernandez, who are going to talk a little bit about their own experience with the fellowship. So Frank Fernandez is an associate professor of educational leadership and policy analysis at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He was a Mellon Foundation Scholars at Risk Fellow in 2022 and a fellow with the University of California's Center for Free Expression, Free Speech and Civic Engagement in 2023 to 2024. His writing about academic freedom has been published by a variety of publications, including Penn State Law Review, The Conversation, Missouri Law Review, Nature, Higher Education Handbook of Theory and Research, among other outlets. He has also been co-facilitating the fellowship for two years, I think now. It's been 2 years. And then Asma Nairi is a current fellow in the 2025-26 cohort. She's a scholar and human rights researcher who specializes in human rights, digital political discourse, and migration in the MENA region. She holds a PhD in international relations and is currently a visiting instructor at Sabancı University in Turkey. Her fellowship project focuses on democratic backsliding and academic freedom in Tunisia. So I will hand it over to you. Frank, why don't you take about 5 minutes, and then Asma, you can take about 5 minutes to both share your experiences in the fellowship.
Sure. Thank you so much, Amy. I'm happy to be talking here today. It's been great being affiliated with SAR for a few years. There's nobody like SAR, right? This is kind of a unique organization, a unique fellowship. It's so challenging to get support to do research on academic freedom. And this is such a great opportunity. And it's neat the way that this year it's being expanded out to break out kind of a US strand and an international strand. So first, speaking as a former fellow, I was very fortunate. I had kind of identified a secondary data set. I wanted to do some statistical research, and I had access to another data set, right? So I wanted to look at the relationship between academic freedom and research production across countries, across time. So I think that's kind of an example of how Amy said that it's okay to kind of have already started something, have already started conceptualizing a project and knowing, that you have data and the direction you're going to go. But maybe you just haven't had enough time or space to do it yet. I think that generally we don't necessarily favor, as a reviewer, we don't necessarily favor projects that are further along. But again, as Amy said, it helps to know. And so I think I was clear about that in my proposal materials I have these data, these are the questions I want to answer. I already have an analytic plan. I just need to carry it out. And it would be great to have a cohort of fellows and mentors through SAR to be able to talk through the work as it's developing. I think that now, having been a reviewer for a couple of years of proposals, that's something that we really look for is the feasibility of the project. And I think that often applicants will look at, I'll be more competitive, look at it this way, right? I'll be more competitive if I promise to do more, if I include more countries, more analyses, more participants. And that doesn't necessarily strengthen the application. Actually, sometimes raises a lot of questions for us of, can they actually do what they think they're going to be doing? Or for example, this proposal is saying that they're going to do interviews across 7 different countries, say. And then it leads us to questions like, why these 7 countries? Are these 7 countries really the best group to compare? So often more manageable, a smaller project, I think, but that's really well justified, right? It tends to be more competitive, I think, from a lot of reviewers' perspectives. So you might want to keep that in mind. Similar for the outputs, right? Which if you've got somebody saying like, I want to finish a book through this, in 10 months, that's just not likely to be feasible. But it does help us when you give us kind of clear examples of not just, I want to write a blog or a report, a white paper or something. When we have really specific examples, what we're then able to do is after we select a cohorts of fellows, we can tailor some of the sessions and bring in guest speakers to really help make sure that fellows feel like they're getting the support that they need. They're getting some novel insights, things that maybe they didn't get in their PhD program or as an early career scholar. So trying to add some professional development, some to supplement all the research training that people have from senior scholars in the field who can talk a little bit about how they've talked about academic freedom on podcasts or blogs or op-eds, things like that. It's really great to see, the variety of applications that we get. And I think that we're always looking for something that's innovative at the same time. We want to make sure that we have the capacity to support every fellow. So the more specific examples you can give. So if we've had some arts-based projects, I don't do scholarship through art, but when we know from your proposal, like, oh, this is to the point that Amy was bringing up before, this is part of a long trajectory of their work, right? And we know that we can support them because they've always done arts-based work and now they want to shift it a little bit in these ways. Okay, we can think about how to support that. So I'll stop there and I'll turn it over to Asma. But again, this is just a great opportunity and we look forward to seeing your applications.
Thank you, Frank. Yeah, I will join you to say that I also feel so lucky to have had this opportunity to be in the SAR fellowship, but also to be in such a great cohort with the great people. And I think that what is, for me, my research has had two stages. The first one is the analysis of the academic knowledge production in Tunisia on 20 years, and that was based on bibliometric methodology. And the second stage is the interviews with Tunisian scholars, which I am now conducting. So I guess like 2 weeks ago, we are now in the presentation of our works, getting feedback from our peers. And I think this is one of the most amazing experiences that I had in my academic life. Because specifically if you are an independent scholar, or if you are on the move, or if you are in a different country or a refugee and doing your research at risk, I think it's very important to have this sense of belonging and community and to get feedback and support. And I think that's very important in my experience. So indeed, it is very rich. People come from different backgrounds, and you are learning basically in each session. The expert sessions were great. I mean, I love the session of Camille, for instance, but also like the sessions like each 2 weeks when you get to learn more about your cohort and the research as it is taking place, it's also very important. So for my own experience, I was able basically to get some more data as well. That was thanks to I covered by the fellowship as well, to get a team like part-time researchers to help me in the data analysis of like almost 10,000 academic articles published over 20 years. So that would be impossible. That would have been impossible without the fellowship, which I am very grateful for. Well, good news is that I was not thinking that I may have something in 10 months, but Frank, when I was presenting, said that basically you do have now something in hand for a first piece of academic research that could be based on the primary data analysis. And I'm honestly like, this is also something that I think it's very important in this fellowship, is that you get because also Frank is an expert in his field in academic freedom. And when you are working alone, you are so much focused on the objectives that you wrote in your application or that you had to yourself. But when you are within the fellowship, you get feedback that can indeed give you other perspectives on how to do your research and to get more outcomes. And it is in fact what I am trying to do this after receiving the encouraging feedback the last time I presented my work. So yeah, that's from my experience. Thank you. Over.
Thank you both, Asma and Frank. There was a question in the chat just now around collaboration, amongst fellows. So I don't know if you have anything to say to this. Maybe Frank, you've been around for a bit longer. I don't know if you have examples of this, but for sure the ongoing feedback, that you receive from your peer, is a good start of that collaboration, right? Getting interested in each other's projects.
I think if I'm understanding the question correctly, it's kind of, can you be, does the project have to be completely like one person doing the whole project by themselves? And I think the answer is no. There are a couple different ways that we could do it. So first off, I was the one who applied for the fellowship, but then as I started doing my fellowship project, I brought on a couple of people to help me with what ended up becoming the paper out of the project. Excuse me. And so that was fine. So I was the fellow, right, participating in all the workshops. But then again, as I kind of moved along, I thought, I wanted to bring somebody in to help me with theory, and then somebody who also helped me do some of the data cleaning. But we've also seen it's not the majority of fellows, but sometimes we will have kind of a duo, a pair of researchers who are working together and kind of apply for the fellowship jointly. My understanding, though, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that doesn't mean double the money necessarily, but but again, it's not atypical to see those applications. I think like anything else in the proposal, what we're looking for is a strong justification for why. So why does it make sense that, two people are, submitting a joint proposal for the fellows program? Is it that you've been working together in the past? You've already been working on this project, right? And now this is kind of supporting a next stage of the project. That you bring complementary strengths. Potentially, it's a comparative project, and so one researcher is, in the first country, and the other researchers in the second country, and then they're working together collaboratively. So most fellows it's one person, but there definitely is a possibility of, if you're working with somebody else to submit that proposal, you just kind of need to help us understand what's going on and why it makes the most sense for the strongest project.
I'll just jump in to add on to that the times that we've awarded the fellowship to a pair of researchers, and usually it's not been more than a pair. It's been researchers who are doing, again, as Frank said, a comparative study, and each of them are based in a particular country. And we've also had researchers who are in one country, but doing contributing to the analysis from different disciplinary perspectives. And so the research collaboration made a lot of sense in terms of bringing kind of to an interdisciplinary project. But yes, just to also confirm what Frank said, it does not mean that there's an $8,000 award for each project. So it's not for each individual. If it's two scholars who receive the award, that $8,000 is divided between the two of them. So just to make sure that everybody knows that. Morgan, if it's okay, I'll answer a couple of the questions that I've seen kind of come up commonly in the chat. First, I'll answer one that we have not answered in written. So this is one about
Before you do
navigating.
that, can I just encourage
Yes.
everyone, if you have any questions and you want to just raise up your hand and take up the floor, that's also an option. So if you want to muster the courage to do so while Amy is speaking, please go ahead. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. So there's currently a question in the Q&A about navigating IRB requirements, institutional or ethical committee at your institution requirements while meeting the research timeline. This is an excellent question, and we've definitely dealt with this. It does slow down. It can definitely slow down research timeline. One answer I will give is that we've had fellows who have needed to apply for IRB while during the period of their fellowship, and they've actually used the fellowship, the workshop function of the fellowship to consult with their fellows and the facilitators about their IRB application. So especially these applications often involve navigating tricky ethical situations and protection of research participants. And so the fellowship has been quite helpful for some of the fellows to figure out answers to the IRB questions and IRB requirements. Beyond that, if IRB review takes a while, it's not, we're not going to hold that against you. It's okay. You don't, I guess, like part of it maybe implied in the question is you do not have to have already submitted your IRB application and had your research approved before receiving this fellowship. And then I will just go ahead and answer a common question that I saw a couple times was, what does the grant support? So how can you use the money for the fellowship? We don't have a reporting requirement. The grant is intended to help you do your research, and so you can use it on anything that makes sense. We've had people use it on research assistance, as Asma was describing, she did. We've had people use it to pay some of their own living expenses so that they can do their research. We've had people use it to support travel to the field. Those are, we've had people use it to support data software that they need, like data analysis software. So we don't really have beyond supporting your research, we don't really have any requirements, and we don't require that you submit documentation. I'm just
Don't see
looking.
any
Yeah,
hands, but maybe another question
go
that we've responded to several times in the chat, so might be worth addressing here around the early career and the 8 years requirement. I think if you're willing to make a case around, what has impacted your career trajectory since completing your PhD over 8 years ago, that's something that could be put forward to the selection committee for consideration, and there is room to make some exceptions should it be warranted. So please do integrate that somewhere in your application, maybe in your CV if you're willing to share some details.
I see a question about whether a budget and narrative is required as part of the application. It is not, just your research plan, so your timeline for your research. And also in terms of field, we don't have disciplinary requirements. So the question here is about the PhD is in management science and engineering. That is fine. We've had, for example, an environmental scientist apply for the fellowship and be awarded the fellowship. The main requirement is that your research is related to academic freedom and higher education values. So typically, I would say the proposals that we see from like the sciences are around how scientific research is used or how scientific research is restricted, because those are the kinds of questions that tend to relate to academic freedom. But I don't think we've seen the universe of questions out there. As long as your research is related to academic freedom and higher education values, it does not matter what discipline you are grounded in. Let's see.
Yeah, a few more questions in
go
the
ahead.
chat around track record interest. I mean, of course, peer-reviewed publications can be included, to show that track record, interest in academic freedom, but it doesn't have to be what you put forward. I think it's about a kind of a general, interest for the issue that can be demonstrated in many different ways. So please don't limit yourself to peer-reviewed publications for that.
There is a question about navigating the fact that we have two tracks this year. So this year, for the first time in the call for proposals, we are asking people to select into either a US track or an international track. I will say that just because your research is on the US does not necessarily mean you have to select into the US track. If you would prefer to be with a global group of applicants and in a workshop with people globally, then you could still apply to the global track. Especially if I would try to make a case about why that is helpful and important for your research to be with other scholars who are looking at the issue from a global perspective. I think I will say in terms of numbers, I think there will be fewer applicants who apply for the US track just because it is narrowly focused on a single country. So the question is, are you looking for specific research topics or navigating or interest in investigating issues of academic freedom in the US versus international? I will say, so the parameters for the US are that your research focuses on the United States. I could potentially see a comparative project, somebody making the case that their comparative project that involves the US and another country they would want to apply for the US track still. But I think the big thing with the US track is that we want to see projects with the potential to influence US policy discussions around academic freedom in the United States. Obviously, if your research has nothing to do with the United States, then you should be selecting into the international track. I hope that answers the question. Feel free to, we will also put the fellowship email address in the chat. So if you have further questions along those lines, feel free to email us.
Yeah, and just for the second part of the question around how
Thanks.
many grants do we have this year? We're granting up to 6 fellowships per track, so 12 in total. That's the goal. Yeah, a few times we've had questions about the professional references. So we are not asking for the actual letter of reference just yet in the process. We're asking for names of professional and contact details of professional references that we could contact should you be, selected in the fellowship. So just name and contact details for now. Can the international track include a single country outside the US? Yes, it can.
I would just add on to that if you're doing a single country, I would make sure that your proposal is not purely descriptive, that it has an analytical dimension. That's going to make your proposal more highly rated. I also see a question, how many applications do you normally receive? The best reference point I can give is last year we received close to 300 applications and we accepted 11 proposals. I am not the best at math, so I will not tell you what percentage acceptance rate that is. But we have also seen the number of applications increasing each year, at least for the past 3 years. So I think it's, not implausible that we would see a higher number this year. Go ahead, Frank, go ahead.
Just wanted to back up something you were saying, Amy. I think that my advice to applicants would be SAR has done an amazing and incredible job putting together so many resources that you can use to help justify your work. So when Amy says, if you're doing a single country international case study, international non-US or comparative study with 2 different countries, let's say, and you want some cues on how to write about it as not just descriptive, but analytical. I think the strongest proposals we see would potentially cite, Scholars at Risk, if you go to their website, under the Learning tab, has, these different reports. They've got the Free to Think reports, but they've got what I would really focus on is the Academic Freedom Principles and the Promoting Higher Education Values reports. And if you're looking through those, if you're, able to draw connections between, this is how SAR writes about how to implement academic freedom as a concept, right? Like there are specific steps, specific principles that SAR has really spent a lot of time trying to highlight because they work across countries. And if you're able to tap into that, right, and show a strong connection for why your work can speak to those, can add new insight, that's going to be a stronger proposal than we get. If you just get some that are like, we're going to interview 10 people about what their challenges are with, doing their work in country X. Those are always valuable, right? Like it's not that we would ever discourage that work, but it's a much stronger proposal if you can talk about how your work supports kind of global efforts to implement academic freedom with scholars all over the place. So I would just encourage you to think about that.
I think I've seen a hand up, but it disappeared. So I don't know if it was a mistake or if someone wants to take the floor. But please don't hesitate to do so if you want to. Amy, there's a question on the assessment part. I don't know if you want to take this one since you've seen many more applications than
Sure.
I have. But yes, for sure, it will depend on the project output and what your end product looks like and how you define that. But Amy.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the big and Frank, feel free to jump in on this because you've been on the selection committee a few times now. I think one of the big distinctions that would change what the assessment what your assessment looks at would be whether your intended outputs are purely academic or whether they have some sort of practical implication. So I mean, I think as an academic answer, publication, you will be successful if you publish in X journal or X journals or produce 2 academic articles from this project. Project will be successful if you publish, an op-ed or several op-eds or, so that's, I would say, the first step. I would say if you're really thinking through kind of practical implications of your project, it's possible that you want your own institution to adopt some kind of policy. And so whether or not that happens related to academic freedom, and so whether or not that happens could be a metric of success that would go beyond sort of the research outputs itself. But it is a little bit hard to answer, I think, because it really does depend on the nature of your project.
Yeah, I think that what we.
Oh, sorry.
I'm
Go,
sorry.
Frank.
I was just going to compliment what Amy said is that I think that we often look at what are you trying to do within the term of the fellowship and what are you doing beyond the term of the fellowship. Because we've talked about it's helping early career scholars who are really trying to develop a long-term research agenda around academic freedom and not just kind of I got funding, so I did this one project and then I moved on. And so you can make that connection. I think another thing that I'll just say quickly is that, as Amy was saying, you have to some sort of affiliation. It doesn't necessarily have to be that you're, working as academic staff, as faculty at a university, but you could be, working at a research organization, a think tank, a nonprofit. And so we would look favorably on those sorts of things too. Like I'm working at this organization and part of my work is going to be featured in a report, for this organization, a short white paper or even a podcast episode, right? Like things like that. If you can show like this is something that my organization does and we're able to reach audiences through this format, just let us know those kinds of things really quickly, right? Just a couple of sentences. But that makes it a lot more compelling.
Yeah. Remy, here you go. You should be able to ask your question and unmute Remy if you want to. Okay, Rami, if you want to unmute and ask your question, please go ahead. While you do that, I'm going to answer just maybe the question on security. Yeah, thank you, of course, for flagging this. We're very well aware that this is, a concern around the world, actually, not just for African, context. In the context of the fellowship, we're going to do our best, to have security assessments and kind of, principles in place to ensure the security of our fellows, in the online spaces that they are going to inhabit, throughout the fellowship. We can also discuss, for instance, keeping your name or your picture out, or your, project details out of our external communications, if that's something that could enhance your security. As for navigating it in day to day, because this is a remote fellowship, I think it's beyond the scope of the fellowships, but we are, of course, aware, experts in navigating these spaces, and definitely willing to work with fellows, around minimizing risks.
Yeah, Morgan, I'll just jump on to that and say that we do publish the names of the fellows and projects along with pictures on our website. However, we have had fellows request that not appear on our website, and in those cases, we do not include any personal details. So we want to facilitate research on these topics, and we don't need to advertise that you are a fellow if that's going to enable you to do the research, but also stay protected.
That's right.
I see a question also about the different stages of the selection process, so maybe I'll just spend a minute walking through what the selection process looks like. There are, I would say, 3 layers of review. The first is internal to scholars at risk, and that is primarily a review to make sure that the proposals meet the selection criteria. Then there's a second round of review by usually a number of staff members at Scholars at Risk to narrow the projects down to, it varies, but down to a set number of finalists or semi-finalists, I suppose, at that stage. And then at that point, the narrowed down list goes to a selection committee, which evaluates the proposals based on the criteria that I went through earlier. And from that, we select a number of fellows and then a number of alternates in case there are fellows who we offer the fellowship to, but who are unable to do it.
Maybe anything around reference check?
Yes, we will reach out after selection is made. We will reach out to references. It's sort of a last confirmation.
But there is no interview, for instance. Someone was asking earlier if there was
no, thank you. No, there is no interview with the candidate as part of the process. I don't see any other open questions for now. And I don't think there's any hands up. Morgan, sorry, Asma and Frank. Okay. There's one more question. And then I was going to ask Asma and Frank, perhaps each of you wants to give, what is your one piece of advice that you would give to people planning to apply to the fellowship? And then if there are no more questions after that, we will wrap up. Morgan, do you want to go ahead and answer this question?
Yeah, so the calendar is still to be confirmed for the very end, of announcements, especially because, as Amy explained, we have a reserve list and a finalist list. So we are aiming for all of this to be done by the end of June or the very early few days of July. So I won't give you an actual date, but it's going to be very beginning of July. Yeah, sorry, another 2 questions, but I guess we'll just continue to answer them in the chat, and then Asma and Frank, you can take the floor and give your advice to our prospective candidates.
I final piece of advice would be that it's a balancing act, but after you review all the previously funded fellows and you're trying to think what's innovative in my work is to help the selection committee understand why it's also innovative in the country context that you're writing in. So sometimes we see proposals that are interesting, but don't have enough familiarity with the country context to understand, right, how Amy talked earlier about projects that can have real clear implications for policy or for changing practice, like on somebody's campus. And if we don't have that context, it's hard to assess how promising it could be in terms of changing policy practice. And so it's hard because you don't have, right, these are short proposals. But sometimes we'll see somebody spend way more time on like a theory or lots of details about the methods, but not give us like real basic context about why this matters in this specific country at this point in time. And so the extent that you can do that is really helpful to the reviewers.
Thanks, Frank. Well, from my side, I mean, as current fellow, I think one thing that helped me, well, first, Frank said this earlier, is that to have concrete outcomes of the project. And I know that by experience that we tend to be very, I mean, to dream a lot when we are thinking about a project, not because, I mean, sometimes you honestly think that you can do it. I mean, when I did the data collection, I did not think that I will be ending up with 10,000 articles. And that meant 4.5 months with like we were our 4 people doing that analysis. Well, it worked well because at the same time the ethical approval took longer than I expected. So at least they had an outcome working on in this period of time. I think that also there is a lot of very important resources on the website of the like Scholars at Risk Network, and I think, I mean, one of the things I would have done differently is just go and try to do some reading as well before putting together my application. Yeah, thank you.
I see a question in the chat about ethical clearance and protecting yourself because you have to get an institutional clearance. And I think my read of the question, I'm not sure I fully understand, but I think my read of the question is whether is in cases where you may have an institution where you're worried about retribution from your own institution, and so you don't necessarily want to flag that you are doing that research to them. I think that's a little bit of a tricky question to answer in the abstract. I think it's a question that we would be willing to, like, I actually think it's a question that we could workshop in the fellowship. It's the type of question that you as a researcher could bring to the fellowship conversation, and we could discuss how to deal with that situation. But yeah, I don't know that I have any more specific answer than that at this point. I don't know if anyone else on the screen has any thoughts or recommendations related to that, wants to add anything. No. Okay. I think basically go ahead.
I mean, we discussed this in this, in fact, in the sessions, and I think Costas had also worked on how ethical approval could become in themselves like tools of censorship and control. And I think that if it is the case, if it's gonna put someone at risk, I mean, this is one of the things that I just learned about, that there are some journals now that would accept your article if you just mention that you are doing everything based like on ethical rules and respecting all ethical rules, but due to this like academic freedom and to explain the situation, and then they would consider your paper for peer review, even though you don't have an official ethical approval. So I think, I mean, of course, Amy and Frank and Morgan, you can give the SAR perspective, but I think that the security and being safe is one of the most important things. And I think that as follows, and we did discuss this, how ethical approvals become themselves tools of censorship and of control and put scholars at risk in different countries. So if I got the
Yeah.
question right.
Yeah, thank you, Asma, for sharing that discussion that we had.
Thank you. Well, I don't see any more questions, and we're almost at time, so I think we can wrap up and give you back this next 5 minutes. We have the email address that you can use for further contact should you need to in the chat, sarfellowships@nyu.edu. So don't hesitate to contact us if you're working on an application and run into any issues. And a reminder that the deadline is 29th of May. So you have a few more.
And I just want to jump in because I see a question about, I want to make sure we clarify some confusion. Scholars at Risk has multiple, I would say, I guess, fellowship programs. The fellowship that we are talking about today is our research fellowship. We also, as an organization, support the protection of scholars at risk, and we have a separate program for that, and a separate application process. I am going to, if we can stay on the chat for 1 minute, I will just put that link to our Scholars at Risk program into the chat. It is different from our fellowship, our research fellowship program. So just give me 1 minute to put that into the chat.
Thanks, Amy.
Okay, I'm just putting into the chat a link to our protection services. Yes, here we are. So just to make sure that nobody is confused by the multiple programs. Okay, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you everyone for joining and have a good rest of your day.